This is the story of the African prince stolen from his kingdom, sold into slavery, and shipped to Natchez, Mississippi, at the height of the slave trade. Abduhl Rahman was the son of King Sori. He was of West African royalty before he was enslaved on a Mississippi plantation in Natchez, Mississippi. After a shackled journey across the Atlantic, he was desperate to make the man about to purchase him, Thomas Foster, understand his terrible mistake. He wasn't supposed to be enslaved. The 26-year-old was the heir to one of Africa's most influential kingdoms, instead of freedom, which he would carry for his next 40 years of enslavement. Little did he know, he actually was a prince. As a joke, but he would find out later the joke was on him, thanks to Dr. John Cox. After his arrival in Natchez, and after being kidnapped by enemy troops in 1788 in his native Fouta-Djallon in what is now known as Guinea, the powerful royal was sold to slave traders for a few muskets and rum at the height of the global slave trade, when an estimated 80,000 Africans were being captured, chained, and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean every year. Abduhl Rahman was a highly educated aristocrat. His dramatic quest for freedom would eventually catapult him to national celebrity, which means his remarkable life is more documented than most. The prince's story divulges the brutalities of slavery. In all the years he longed for liberty, he made his stance so dramatic that he would capture the attention of American President John Quincy Adams. There is actually a movie you can watch. It's called A Prince Among Slaves. It's the story about Abduhl Rahman and about Thomas Foster, his slave owner. In addition, Dr. John Cox, who was an Irish doctor who migrated to Natchez. Now, several years prior to Abduhl being abducted as a slave and brought to Natchez, Dr. John Cox was overseas in Africa, and he was assisting medical needs for the country. Somehow, he got left behind in Africa. His ship left him, and he was stuck there for 6 months. He ran in to the prince's father, King Sori, who took him in, was very nice to him, helped him out. If it wasn't for him, the 6 months that Dr. John Cox ended up staying there, he probably would not have survived. Fast forward a few years later, after Prince Abduhl Rahman has been abducted and brought to America, where he will serve out as slave for 40 years. He runs into Dr. John Cox, and I'm going to tell you about that story in the video to come. So, before I get to that video where I explain a lot more about Cox's involvement and his significance, the prince that was kidnapped and sold and indentured as a slave for 40 years, I want to talk a little bit about Cox, as Cox ran into him years later. But I'm just going to read this real quick. The prince ran into Cox at the market where he was hawking vegetables. Cox saw an opportunity not only to right a grave injustice, but to repay his debt to the Sori's family. He set about trying to buy his freedom. Foster refused at any cost. As a matter of fact, it wasn't until Dr. John Cox came along and confronted Foster, and he was the one that actually confirmed that yes, you do own a prince for a slave. Well, this just made Thomas Foster's head even bigger. He's like, oh really, he's a slave? Well, I'm not going to sell him for any amount, because Cox did try to buy his freedom and offered him $1,000, but Foster would not budge. Now, backing back up, you have to remember Dr. John Cox. He went to Africa and became shipwrecked. He only survived because he was rescued by a group of Fulanis who brought him to Timbo. There he met King Sori and his royal family, who offered him medical care and friendship over a 6-month stay. So you can see why, years later, when Cox runs into the prince, he's like, he's so happy to see him. He's like, I owe you whatever you need. I can't believe you're even here. It's like, it's got to be a shock to him. Because even Cox himself is an immigrant from Ireland. So what are the chances that both of them would eventually end up in the same place? And if it wasn't for Cox, he paved the road for the freedom of Abduhl Rahman. When the prince was 67 years old, he was retired from hard labor and gained his freedom through the efforts of a printer, Andrew Marshall, editor of the Mississippi State Gazette. Marshall enlisted the aid of Thomas B. Reed, senator from Mississippi, and of Henry Clay, who was then Secretary of State under John Quincy Adams. Unfortunately, when he set off sail for that last time at 67 years old, back to Africa with his wife, he died during his long journey home. He made it to Liberia, and shortly after that, he developed a high fever and he passed away. Sadly, Abduhl Rahman never made it back to his homeland to see his other children and the rest of his family. Okay, we are on a search for one elusive grave we just cannot find, and it's killing me. I have got to find it. It's the grave of Dr. John Cox, who assisted the prince among slaves, Prince Abduhl Rahman. I think I said that right. He was the one that ended up in Africa way before they, kidnapped the prince and brought him to Mississippi, right here in Natchez, where he was made a slave for 40 years. Well, prior to that, before that happened, Dr. John Cox actually was on a trip to Africa. I can't remember why. I have to look that up. But the main point is he tried to help Abduhl. Abduhl had helped him out when he got left behind because the ship left without him. And there is a documentary, and I know it's on Amazon Prime, called A Prince Among Slaves. And the title, 40 Years a Slave, is about Prince Abduhl Rahman. He helped Dr. John Cox in Africa. For 6 months he was stuck there. And without Abduhl's help, he probably would not have survived. Well, fast forward, when he was taken as a prisoner and then shipped to America during the height of the slave trade, he ran into Mr. Cox, Dr. Cox. He ran into him at a market where he was allowed to sell some vegetables. His slave owner allowed him to do that every Sunday. And when Dr. Cox ran into him, he was just like, "Oh my God, it's you. And
one eye and black patch. His name was John Cox. He served as a ship surgeon on an English vessel. He
He had gone ashore, and when he could not be found, his ship sailed without him. He fell ill and stayed for 6 months with the greatest hospitality. He was the first white man to reach Timbo.
Boy, where do you come from?
I come from Foster's place.
You weren't born in this country.
No, I come from Africa.
From Timbo.
Yes, that is my home.
Is your name Abduhl Rahman?
Yes, that is my name.
Do you know who I am?
I know you very well. You are Dr. Cox.
Dash down your potatoes and come to my house.
Make a long story short, he tried to barter with Foster. I can't remember, Thomas Foster, I believe. Anyway, he was the slave owner. And he would not. He was like, oh, you mean he really is a prince? He was like, yeah, he's a prince. He doesn't belong here and everything. And he would not let go of him. But it led to getting the attention of the president, John Quincy Adams. But he wouldn't guarantee the release, the freedom of Rahman's children, who he married over here in Natchez. He married again. He had to. He had no choice. Life had to go on, right? And he had 9 children here in Natchez, but they wouldn't release. They wouldn't release the children, and I guess they became free after the abolition. Slavery was abolished, but we are in search of his grave, and Dr. John Cox is the one that really tried to help him, and he did. He actually did eventually. I mean, it led to his freedom. Unfortunately, Prince Abduhl Rahman died when he and his wife made the trip back to Monrovia in Africa, which is named after the President James Monroe. Liberia is known for, I mean, they speak English there. It's like they call it the second America. I don't know, but that's where most of your slave trade took place, to bring slaves to America, was in Liberia, Monrovia. So I'll let you know if we find it. Find Dr. John Cox. He's out here somewhere.